Okay, now we're going to go through the Delivering Community Service in Partnership policy in a little bit more detail. So what this diagram represents is the flowchart of the policy, and as you can see, the policy is set out into three different categories. You've got the nature of the relationship changes, which I guess focus on a shift, kind of a seismic shift between the way in which government agencies and not-for-profit organisations deal with one another. You've got the funding and contracting options, which I guess is where a lot of the focus has been so far in terms of these reforms, and that basically just looks at the way in which services are funded. And then you've got reducing the administrative burden, and that's looking at the way in which previously perhaps there's been quite a lot of emphasis on the reporting that the sector has had to provide to government. So the reducing the administrative burden kind of looks at the ways in which we can start to reduce how much time and how much burden there is often in an administrative context. So it's important to note that this is the intent of the policy. It has not to date, I guess, rolled out exactly like this, probably because a lot of the reforms have been focusing around that $604 million that Lynn spoke about previously and how that's been injected into the sector, which means there's been quite a focus on the funding and contracting options. But going forward, there will be, I guess, a more blanket emphasis on the entirety of the policy. So now we'll go through a bit of what the actual changes are. So the first change is around the rebalancing of the nature of the relationship between not-for-profit organisations and the government agencies. So I guess the premise behind this, and Lynn would have spoken a little bit about it, is that not-for-profit organisations have so much inherent expertise to offer to the process of coming up with a community outcome and undertaking a needs analysis. So rather than a traditional contracting relationship where government just puts the money on the table and not-for-profit organisations say, yep, no problem, I can deliver that service, the idea is that we include them into that process of deciding on what those outcomes are to begin with. The other, I guess, major thing to look at here is that in the concept of partnership, being involved at all of these stages isn't just up to government agencies to do, it's up to community service organisations to say, look, I should be involved in this process and you need to include me. The other important thing to note about this part of the policy is that it's focusing really on everything that happens before a tender even goes out. So the community outcome, the needs analysis and the strategic response strategy, which is kind of a fancy way of saying service design, collaborative service design, they're stages that all happen before a tender even goes out on Tenders WA. And I guess that's a really critical part of the policy because it's something that hasn't really happened in the past. It's not something that that government agencies and not-for-profit organisations are used to. So it's something that is going to take a little while probably to understand and to really recognise how it's going to affect our practices. The second major change that we'll look at is around this community outcome and I guess the way in which not-for-profit organisations and government agencies collaborate to come up with the community outcomes that we're looking to achieve within the sector. So I guess while some line agencies have started along this process of deciding on how community outcomes are decided upon and delivered, there's a lot of other line agencies that haven't really started this process. So I guess what's out there in the sector currently is a little bit of everything, really. So whilst it's not entirely clear on the exact process of coming up with a community outcome for every single government agency, that's something that hopefully as the policy rolls out will become a lot more clearer to us. I guess the other thing the questions that we ask at the community outcome stage are questions around what are the shared goals between not-for-profit organisations and the government agencies. How do they align with government directions? How does what clients need and what not-for-profit organisations think we need align with the government directions? And what what are we trying to achieve for individuals and communities that we're delivering these services in? And I guess, again, as I mentioned before, in the context of partnership, it's not just up to government agencies to make sure they're including not-for-profit organisations in this process. It's also up for not-for-profit organisations to be able to say, look, I know that I should be involved in this process of community outcome. And whether it's as an individual organisation or whether it's through a peak body, that's definitely a discussion that not-for-profit organisations need to recognise that they should be entering into. The next major change that we'll look at is the needs analysis. And effectively, this is just looking at what community outcome we're looking to achieve and then making sure we have an adequate understanding of what's required to achieve that community outcome. So I guess at this stage, we're asking questions along the lines of what is required to achieve that desired community outcome. who else should be involved, and looking at, I guess, who else is affecting change in the area and who else should be involved in that discussion. The really important thing also about the needs analysis and also about the community outcome stage is that we need to be looking at the ways in which clients are involved in that process. So it's not just about government agencies and not-for-profit organisations coming together to talk about community outcomes and the needs analysis. It's about the people who are actually using these services and are the clients of these services. How are we including them into those decision-making processes? I guess the idea here is that more research and planning is incorporated to assess that service need and that community outcome that we've been talking about. The next major change that we'll talk about is the strategic response strategy. This one's really the critical stage of service design. So as you can see in the diagram, what we're looking at here is the way in which, I guess, the service is delivered, and then that falls into, in the next part of the diagram, well, if this is the service that we're delivering, what's the best and most effective way then to fund that? So under the strategic response strategy, there's three different things in the diagram. You've got building capacity, so this is just sort of looking at, is our current service delivery model effective? And if so, is it just a matter of increasing the number of resources that we give to that particular model? The second question we might be asking is if this service is not the most effective way to be achieving that community outcome and affecting change in this community, is there a different service model that's been proved up and that we're happy to maybe trial and fund and see if that's a better way of achieving that community outcome? Or thirdly, do we need to be doing more research? Like, do we need to be looking at a few pilot projects to see if there's a more effective way to be delivering that community outcome? So this discussion around the strategic response strategy really is something else that needs to be conducted with not-for-profit organisations, because they have, the experience with these service delivery models and whether or not they are affecting change on the ground in the way that clients need them to be. So I guess the questions we ask at this point are around what is the appropriate service to meet the needs of the community and that community outcome that we've already discussed, which community service organisations may be able to help design or deliver on that service, and do we need to increase the capacity, or do we need to just change the model of the service delivery that we're providing? And this stage really requires funding agencies, as I said before, to bring together not only not-for-profit organisations, but also the clients that are using that service. And that's critical because, again, it's not something, I guess, that's really done to an extent at the moment. So again, it requires quite a seismic shift in thinking on the part of government agencies and not-for-profit organisations. So now we'll look at funding and contracting reform, and I guess this bit is the critical part for the current reforms, because that's where I guess a lot of the emphasis is currently focusing on. So the funding and contracting options part sort of provides for two key mechanisms, which you can see in the diagram. The first is the funding arrangements and the second is contracting arrangements. And under funding arrangements, you've got grants and flexible arrangements such as low interest loans and direct to citizen payments, or the concept of individualised funding. And under contracting arrangements, you've got service agreements and commercial contracts. So I guess none of these are new. Grants and service agreements are things that the not-for-profit sector has been dealing with for a really long time. So I guess the question is, what's different about these under the auspices of the policy? And the answer to that is that there's a new level, I guess, of flexibility, innovation and adaptability. So it should be pretty open, for example, under flexible arrangements, if a not-for-profit organisation can have a discussion around the way in which they're funded. So the policy is meant to allow, I guess, for more of a two-way dialogue under funding and contracting options. I guess the other thing to point out here is that under the DCSP policy, there's a bit of new terminology being put out into the sector, and that's this concept of tendering a price to government. So this tendering a price to government is basically just a way of saying putting forward your most sustainable price to your government agency. It's not necessarily related specifically to tendering, and that's sometimes something that can be a bit confusing, but it's really just looking at what is your most sustainable price, which is something that Jeff will talk about a little bit later, and putting that or tendering that price forward to government. And I guess that process in itself has been a little bit complicated by the fact that government agencies are putting forward a maximum price. So the policy hasn't really been a silver bullet for our concerns around sustainable funding. Like there's still not enough money really for us to be doing the work that we need to be doing, and the policy doesn't really provide a solution to that. So what we're finding is that some government agencies will put forward their maximum budget that they have for a particular service, and that's just kind of what's happening. It's not necessarily meant to happen, but it's one thing that is happening. So I guess the message that we're trying to put out to the sector is that that's fine if that happens, but a government agency, if they give you their maximum budget, they can't tell you exactly what service delivery model they want. And on the flip side of the coin, if a government agency puts forward a service delivery model, they can't tell you what price to deliver it for. So effectively, you've got one of two options. They can put forward a maximum price and say, no service delivery model, and say, what can you deliver for this amount of money? Or they can put forward a service delivery model with no maximum price and say, this is the delivery model, what price can you do this for? But if they put forward both a price and a service delivery model, that impacts on a not-for-profit's ability to tender a sustainable price for them. So hopefully that makes sense, because I've been told I go through that a little bit too quickly. But if you kind of think about it, if a government agency puts forward both a price and a service delivery model, there's no, wiggle room for a not-for-profit organisation to include some of the things that Jeff will talk about later, which is margins for insurance and margins for risk and these kinds of things. But if it's just a service delivery model, then you can put any price that's sustainable for you on it. And if it's just a price, then you could, for example, only do part of what is usually delivered under that service. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please feel free to contact us at WACOS. I think that's the major thing around the funding and contracting options. The only other thing I guess I'll mention is that the policy doesn't provide a silver bullet, but I guess what it does provide for us is the ability to put forward evidence-based information, so that going forward, potentially we can change, the way in which government allocates their funds. So if a sustainable price is constantly being put forward for a particular service and there's never been enough money to, fully sustainably fund that service, what I guess doing this under the policy does provide us with an opportunity to be putting forward, really clear evidence that this service has been underfunded for a long period of time. Yeah. So the last change we'll talk about is reducing the administrative burden. There's been 4 major things that have happened under this sort of part of the policy. There's been a streamlining of the administration of funding and contracting options. There's been the implementation of what's called a master agreement. So basically, if you might have a number of contracts with a particular department, you can sort of roll all of these contracts under one master agreement. And what that means is that you don't need to report on every single separate one of your contracts. You can just report once to the same department. So to my knowledge, organisations that are eligible for master agreements have been provided with some information around that. So if you do think you might be eligible for that, it's probably worth contacting your funding body just to talk to them about that option. The third major thing that's happened under the reducing the administrative burden has been the implementation of a number of different standardised templates. So the idea behind this is that no matter which department you might be dealing with, or which, department within a department you might be dealing with, the idea is that you have the same templates, therefore you're not having to constantly rework your material to fit under, the auspices of every single different department. So the idea is that you have the ability to, reduce your burden of administration and not have to deal with so many different ways of reporting. The fourth major thing that's happened has been the move to outcomes-based measurement and reporting. And this is something that I guess we haven't seen a lot of how it's going to impact on reducing the administrative burden. At the moment, the change to outcomes has been something that has been a little bit burdensome, but I guess in a transitionary period, that's something to be expected. So ultimately, the idea behind reducing the administrative burden in outcomes-based reporting is that rather than reporting on a number of different outputs, as has been the case for quite a long period of time, the idea is that you can choose or work with your funding body to figure out which bits are actually going to help you prove up that outcome. So the ultimate goal is not reporting on all of these little outputs. The ultimate goal is reporting and proving up that you're meeting that community outcome. So that process is a bit complicated by the fact that a lot of the government agencies haven't gone through the process yet of looking at the community outcomes and how they're going to measure them. But it's something that hopefully, as we transition into the policy a little bit more, that will eventually become a bit more clear to the sector and how that's going to roll out. So in terms of where we're up to, the nature of the relationship changes to the Partnership Forum, which provides that strategic governance of the policy, encourages direct feedback, and departments are looking at different ways in which they're engaging with their community service organisations. But as I mentioned before, it's not really a standardised approach across departments. So each department's at a really different level of understanding and engagement with the policy, which affects in turn how they deal with their community service organisations. The funding and contracting options side of things, so the Component 1 funding increase has been implemented for those eligible services, and the Component 2 funding will be implemented over 2013 to 2015 as contracts are renegotiated. So what's happening with Component 2 at the moment is that government agencies are collecting the data to be able to put forward to Department of Finance to figure out how much money they'll get, and then within each department, they'll allocate the funding accordingly to their services. So it's not an across-the-board 10% that services receive. It's going to be dependent on how much your department receives and then how much of that your service receives. And finally, under reducing the administrative burden, it's not entirely clear yet, I guess, how outcomes will reduce the administrative burden, but I think there are a lot of opportunities within the policy for organisations to put forward what's good for them, I guess, because there's not a lot of certainty at the moment in the sector. It's a good opportunity for community service organisations to put forward what works for them. So one example is that LinkQuest, as the peak body for family and community services in the Southwest, they've put forward to the Department for Communities that they would like to use results-based accountability as the measurement mechanism for their services, and the Department for Communities has accepted that. So that's a good example of the sector saying, look, do you know what's going to work for us? This will work for us. And being able to take advantage of the fact that, not everything is set in concrete in terms of outcomes at the moment. So has anyone got any questions, I guess, around all of those policy changes? So in terms of the community outcome, under the policy, it allows for the government agencies and not-for-profit organisations to have discussions to come up with that jointly. So I guess how that looks in practice is so far what we've seen is, so Department for Communities, for example, has held a number of small workshops with some of their service providers and sort of jointly come up with that outcome. So it's been a real joint process. Some government agencies have taken a bit of a different process, so they haven't necessarily done forums, but they've kind of used the same outcomes that they used on previous contracts. So there hasn't necessarily been that same process of consultation around the community outcome. I think ultimately it's meant to be a joint process, so kind of like that process we talked about with Department for Communities coming up with it jointly, whether it be through workshops or whether it's some other mechanism. That's what should happen, because ultimately under the policy you're including clients in that process as well. And if it's a government department just saying, look, these are the outcomes, there's no way that the clients have been included in that process. But I think in practice at the moment what we're finding is that because the policy is still in transition, it's not really clear exactly where and how the outcomes are coming up with.